I heard my name called in the woods at 2:17 a.m. It wasn't a whisper or the kind of voice the dark tricks you into thinking you recognize. It was clear, like someone had stepped up to the edge of the tent and leaned in close, pronouncing each syllable as if they were folding it into the night. The name landed on my ribs, right where the panic tends to pool. For a second I couldn't tell if my teeth had rattled it out or my own throat had chewed it and spat it back. But it was not a dream, and it did not come from inside the tent. We were supposed to be at a campsite. That was the plan. A weekend stop after a theme park, a cheap tent, bad coffee in the morning, then back on the road. But the tournament had filled every official place to sleep within an hour's drive, and by the time we reached the coast, the light had bled out of the day. There was a gravel parking lot behind a thin stand of pines, a path that led 10 minutes through scrub to an empty beach, and an old car that had been left to settle into the gravel like a thing that had never had anywhere else to go. It smelled like engine oil and salt. Anna and I were in the middle tent. My parents were 2 tents over. We did what you do when you're trying to make a bad situation bearable. We set up camp with all the small ceremonials of safety. We zipped our sleeping bags, we double-checked the cooler, we wrapped our phones in jackets so the glow wouldn't show through the thin nylon. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath when I sat up to peer at the car, or when I stepped out to stifle a cigarette and listen to the ocean hiss far away. The night seemed empty, except for the occasional clink of something metal further in the trees. A small, offhand sound I told myself was a trash can lid, a late fisherman, a rabbit with a headstrong habit of knocking over the same wrapper. If this is the kind of story you follow because it makes your palms sweat and your heartbeat climb, then you probably already pictured how the night deepens. The ordinary becomes uncanny by accumulation. One creak, then another. A distant engine that sounds like it's thinking about starting and decides against it. A shadow that doesn't quite belong to any tree. That is where I want to be honest. Everything that felt silly in daylight becomes a betrayal of reason at night. You can explain a lot of noises away, but you can't make the name you sleep with in your mother's voice stop ringing like a bell over your chest. If you like these kinds of stories, hit subscribe. We share them every week. Reconstructed. The exact words we said to each other that night are approximate. The mood and actions are based on memory. The route to that parking lot is a ribbon of asphalt that curls along the coast, a place where towns thin out and the world opens like a photograph of itself. We had been driving since noon, full of sugar and bad decisions, and the sun fell somewhere between us and the theme park's closing gates.
When we realized every campsite booked was full, my dad's response was practical in a way that never felt reckless. "Park in the gravel," he said. "There's no one here. We'll be fine." Anna laughed, the sort of laugh people use to lock something absurd into possibility. My parents traded looks. We ate pasta from a pot lit by the truck's dome light and pretended the cold wasn't moving through the tent seams. The parking lot itself had a single light on a pole, an unforgiving circle that washed the gravel in a weak yellow pool. The old car sat at the edge of that light, its paint eaten in places and its tires half sunk. Someone had written, in salt streaked from the windows, a name or number that the wind had already begun to erase. There was a trunk latch that clicked now and then, as if something inside the vehicle was restless. At first, we joked about ghosts, because it's a thing you do when you want to make the unknown into something you can name and laugh at. The joke stopped being funny sometime after midnight. We went to bed later than we planned because we were exhausted and because sleeping in the car felt childish. Even though the tents were thin and the world felt very near, there was a sense of ordinariness to the way the night began. Their tent voices low and comfortable, the pulse of someone snoring 2 tents down. I remember the first time I woke and thought about getting up. It was only minutes after I'd dozed. My body knows the pattern of rest too well. A faint light had suddenly passed by the tent like a thumb sweeping the sky. It flickered across the fabric, briefly spotlighting a hand or a jacket, making a tree look like a person would. At first, the small sounds were the kind that you arrange into normality. The clank of a shovel, someone digging a fire pit, I told myself. A trunk slam, someone closing a trunk to keep the cold out. A car that sped off, drunk tourists, a late return to the ferry. But each ordinary explanation thinned under the weight of the night. The shovel clacked again, harder, and this time it tailed off into a sound like someone stomping on gravel. The old car that had been parked gave a soft rattle, as though something in it had taken a breath and tried to move. When the scream came, it cut through the night like a fault line. It was a man's voice, not animal, too loud, too raw. It came from the tree line between us and the beach, a stretch of dark that should have been empty. It didn't last. It was a single jagged sound that stopped before you had time to understand its shape. That stoppage is what did the work in the dark. A scream that ends too soon makes more noise in your head than a scream that keeps going. We all froze. One of my parents whispered a question to the air. Anna pressed her hand into mine so hard I still have the memory of the pressure. After the scream, there was a heavy, expectant quiet. Small sounds seemed to change their intention.
The crickets went louder, as if embarrassed. The wind carried the smell of the sea and something metallic. I remember thinking of every true crime thread I'd ever skimmed in the middle of the night, each detail a small, cruel tutor. Predators sometimes announce themselves by testing response. Sometimes they try to wake you. Sometimes they only want to hear if someone answers. I'm not a person who indulges paranoia easily, but the brain substitutes history when the present is ambiguous. I began cataloging possibilities in the silence, a methodical exercise to stave off panicking. Drunk teenagers, a man lost on the path, hunters looking for illegal blazes. When the footsteps started circling the tents, everything narrowed down to the tent walls and the breath in my nose. The sound of footfall on gravel has a density to it that carries distance and direction. It started as a slow sweep, the kind of calculating movement you hear in a movie when the bad guy is poking his head into every room. Circle, circle. The footsteps moved beyond one tent, past another, the weight of each step measured and controlled. They paused near a rope stake and then went on. A car approached and slowed, tires whispering across the gravel, and a light hit the tent's fabric like a painter's stroke. For a breath, the world outside the tent was a silhouette of metal and a shape that might be a man. We did not open the tent. That would have been an invitation. Instead, we pulled our sleeping bags tighter, flattened ourselves to the floor, swallowed every instinct that wanted the light or air or any normal human response. My phone was face down against my leg, the black screen a small, comforting absence that kept the glow from signaling our position. Anna's breathing hitched and smoothed like a panel of waves. My heart pounded like a second pulse in my throat. We stayed still because the logic of it felt absolute. Move and you reveal yourself. Make a sound and you become proof. It was only later I would realize the enormity of the micro-decisions we made, tiny choices about silence, about where to crouch, that might have felt like instinct but were also luck. In between every step and the car lights, I tried to keep my reasoning active as a thin band of light. Maybe the footsteps belonged to someone checking the tents, a drunk or a policeman avoiding confrontation. Maybe the man who screamed was injured and someone else was circling to help. Those reasonable scenarios keep you from melting down in the moment, but they do little to stop the body from acting as if it is in imminent danger. My palms were slick, my mouth dry. The gravel under the tent floor scraped my back with each small movement, and somehow the sensation felt louder than any outside sound. There was a moment when I thought about calling out. Not for help, God no, but into the dark to see if the night would answer back.
I imagined the name coming back like an echo to show me there was someone there, human, flawed, real. Instead, I heard a rustle like clothing and a quiet rasp that might have been breath. It sounded close enough to be at the edge of the tent, as if someone was leaning over and taking me in, studying the rise of my chest through nylon. The decision to stay silent was a small conspiracy between us. Anna's hand found my knee and squeezed, a code. At 2:17 a.m., nothing about time felt ordinary. Clocks are useless in that hour. Time becomes a smear of minutes you measure only by how many times your breath moves in and out. The wind had dropped. The stars were pocketed like pinpricks in a dark cloth. The single lamp in the lot hummed with an unsteady orange light that made the old car appear papery. It was then I heard my name. It came from somewhere in the woods beyond the parking light, a voice taking aim through a lattice of trunks. It wasn't muffled by the tent. It slipped right in. The intonation was casual, like a neighbor calling over a fence, but the intention felt focused and deliberate. I can still recall the way the sound traveled. No echo, no distant hollow, but clean and aimed. My name has a standard weight in my mouth, familiar and soft. Hearing it called from the dark rearranged that weight into something accusatory, urgent, intimate in a way it had no right to be. My body turned traitor in the next few seconds. The muscles in my neck locked. My teeth felt calorific. I tasted metal. I didn't call back. Saying anything seemed dangerous, as though vocalizing my existence to the dark would be to expose the fact of my breath and my heartbeat like a lantern. I wanted to crawl under something, to fold into the shape of not being seen. Anna's hand was there again, her fingers digging into my skin so hard I could feel the red rings afterward. She mouthed my name without sound. Reconstructed, it is unclear the exact sequence of whispered syllables between us in those minutes, but the pressing of hands and the silent mouthings are consistent with memory. The call didn't repeat. It did not laugh or shout. It simply hung in the air long enough to become a membrane. For a moment I tried to pinpoint the direction and failed. Voices in the woods are stunningly deceptive. The trees toss and fold them until you can't tell if something is behind you or ahead, to the left or right. The tent was a small paper world with the outside pressing in. I thought I heard another footstep, a deliberate crunch that felt closer than the call had. When a car's headlights swept over the parking light again, the light felt like examination. It paused, parked maybe 3/10 away, and for half a second you could make out the silhouette of a man moving at the edge of the bulb. The headlights moved on, the engine idled, and then the car rolled away like a tide pulling back. We were not brave.
We were, if anything, excellently cowardly in that perfectly human way, fully alive and determined to survive. At some point, my dad whispered, as if testing the edges of sanity, that we should get in the car and drive. His voice cracked slightly, and the words fumbled together. He sounded smaller than he had that afternoon. My mother responded with a calmness that felt brittle. "Wait," she said. "Let's see if the police pass." Those words were a bad truce. "Sit here," she seemed to say, "and maybe someone will come." We stayed for minutes that felt like years. Outside, the world kept moving in brief, alarming episodes. A trunk slammed somewhere deeper in the lot. A shovel sounded again, metal striking metal, with a deliberate rhythm that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Once, a man called out, not my name this time, but something coarse, perhaps to someone who answered him. I couldn't make out the words. It could have been a conversation, as mundane as two guys joking. It could have been a search. The human mind will take both and press them into whichever narrative keeps you breathing. As the night crawled on, cars continued to come and go. They would slow near the tents, swivel lights for a moment, and then move off. Every passing vehicle felt like an interrogation. Once, a pair of headlights stopped at the old car, the beam catching something metallic in the back, like a shovel handle, making it glint as if an invitation. The beam lingered, and a figure stepped out, moving with long, casual strides. The figure was a silhouette, a black cutout against white light. For a ridiculous instant, my mind imagined a long-armed man like a shadow puppet. He paced near the tents and then moved away. I suppose we were lucky that nothing more happened. It is possible our luck was just one small coin among many. By the time a siren might have made sense, there was only an exchange of lights, police perhaps patrolling without stopping, or locals avoiding the scene. I later learned a police car had driven by, but the timing and details of their presence that night are not fully clear from memory. This is an approximation based on later recollection and reports. At one point, a car actually pulled close enough that the headlights lit the tent's side like a harsh camera flash. I could see through the fabric the shadow of a head moving slowly, the outline of someone perhaps leaning over to look. My lungs made a sound that felt like a betrayal. Morning came in a way that didn't feel like dawn so much as relief turning on. The cold kept all the edges sharp, painting breath in little white puffs over the gravel. We packed in a fog of caffeine and trembling, the motions automatic. We left before the sky had fully washed itself bright. I kept glancing at the spot where the old car had sat, half expecting to see marks we hadn't noticed, evidence we could show to police.
There was a small impression in the gravel, a swirl of disturbed pebbles near the tent line, but nothing conclusive. On the drive away, my hands were tight on the steering wheel. The radio buzzed in the background, news about mundane things, and in the small windows of human chatter, I built a scaffold of what-ifs. What if the voice had been from some prank? What if a lost man had called my name by coincidence? What if it had been someone who'd been watching us all evening? Questions stacked like plates I could not wash. We didn't talk much. Conversation felt obscene and ordinary in the same breath. That day, after we had eaten something that tasted of safe, garlic-rich normalcy, I started looking things up. There's a narrowing of the world after you are called by your name in the dark. Suddenly, the map of a place fills with potential threats. I searched local news for any reports of assaults or missing people near that beach. I scrolled through forums where urban explorers posted photos of abandoned cars and places they'd slept in the dark for the thrill of it. I found an old article about a violent incident near that stretch of coast years before, an unsolved murder near a beach, a car left in the gravel, but the details were fuzzy, names redacted, photos grainy. The brain wants to make tidy lines between events. This happened there, therefore we should be alarmed here. It helps you feel like there is a narrative that makes sense. It also makes dread into a companion. When you hear your name in the dark, the world does something peculiar to your sense of privacy.
Your name is a private tether. Someone aims it, and suddenly you feel observed in a way that was previously reserved for grief or love. The intimacy of voice is the worst kind. Predators, if that is what this was, know that. They know how to use sound to rearrange your sense of safety. The memory of being called haunts me not because of any wound inflicted, but because of the intimacy of the knowledge that someone outside the tent might have been familiar enough with us or with me to use my name. It is a small, terrifying claim of possession. There are other stories that come back to me now when I try to make sense of that night. I think of a babysitter who found a man in a parked car across the street, who woke to the sound of a child's name in a voice she didn't know. I think of a woman who, late at night, heard footsteps in her attic and found no explanation. I think of urban explorers who say they were chased out of abandoned schools by men who waited in the wings. These are not my stories to tell in full. They arrived later in my research, posts in dark corners of the internet, whispers from friends, and the rustle of local lore. They stitch together like a quilt of warning. Each vignette is different, but the pattern is similar. The predator uses time, darkness, quiet, and the veneer of normalcy as tools.
One memory particular to the coast, an old news clipping I read later, haunted me. It spoke of a man seen arguing near a beach parking lot years earlier, someone who had been pulled from the sea, who had disappeared from records in a way that felt unfinished. I cannot assert a connection. I will not invent one. All I can say is that after I heard my name, I felt like I had stepped into a pre-existing story, history pressed at the edges of the night. Reconstructed. References to specific articles and the precise content of clippings are an amalgam of later searches and local anecdotes. They are indicative rather than definitive. In the days that followed, I found myself listening differently. A name called from a house window across the street would make me stiffen. A stranger's question at a checkout register might make my hands tremble. The incident rewired something small and important, my assumption of benign intention in strangers. That assumption had been a social lubricant my whole life. Someone calling you by name in a place where your name shouldn't be known is a small theft of innocence. It is a theft that does not leave bruises, but leaves an aftertaste. Back in the weeks that lay between that night and the settling of day-to-day routines, I replayed the sound until it became less a memory and more an artifact I could handle. I would sit in the dark and let the name play back in different tones, friendly, mocking, bored, urgent. Each version rearranged the meaning. I practiced responses. What would I have done if I had been braver? If I had unzipped and yelled back? If I had thrown a shoe or screamed until someone came? Each what if was a small exercise in grief for the night I didn't create. In truth, the only reliable action I took that night was not an action at all. We didn't open the tent. That inaction preserved a line between us and whatever was outside, and that line is precious in the calculus of survival. People often ask, months later, whether we called the police, whether we reported the old car, whether there were follow-ups. I answer as honestly as my memory allows. We were shaken, we packed, and we left before any conclusive investigation could be made. I later made inquiries, but the information was partial and reluctant. Community memory is a tricky thing. Facts fray at the edges as quickly as stories do. Sometimes people want certainty, sometimes they want confirmation. Mostly, I wanted to know whether we were naive or lucky, whether the call was an accident or intent. The lack of a clear answer is the hardest part to sleep with. There is an absurd choric quality to nights like that, small repeated noises acting as meta-notes while the main theme is a single impossible line. Someone knows you, enough to use your name. That line keeps humming. Later, I would try to map my actions onto a template for survival, but when you're living through fear, the templates are softer than you think.
You aren't a subject in a training manual. You're a person with a body and relationships and a complete inability in that moment to predict what the next breath will be. I wish I could tell you I had an epiphany that night, some bright lesson in courage. Instead, what stuck was the wake of ordinary choices. The decision to sleep in the lot because it was cheap, the choice not to call out, the way we froze when the lights swept across the tent. Those small choices accumulate into a story that sits heavy on me when the wind comes in late and the houses go quiet. At 2:17 on certain nights, my mind still returns to the exact tonality of the voice. For a long time afterward, I would wake at that time, acutely aware of the place where the voice had touched me, and check the windows, the doors, the hallways. There are threads I'm deliberately not pulling on yet. The police reports I read later are fragmentary. Witness accounts conflict. Some of what I found in forums and old news reports could very well be unrelated incidents that my brain braids into a single cable. Memory tends to make a neat rope out of fraying strings. I will return to those threads in time to explain what I could confirm and what I had to reconstruct for the sake of a coherent narrative. For now, in the rawness of remembering, I keep to the sequence I can own: the lot, the old car, the shovel, the scream, the footsteps, and the voice that cut through all of it and called me by name. The night didn't end when we drove away. It ended as an incision that left a scar you can't see. On the drive home, the windows up against the wind, the tent smell lingering in my clothes, I realized that the danger of that night wasn't just the possibility of physical harm. It was the invasion of the small private things: your name, your pattern of movement, the knowledge that someone might be out there using the same sounds that mean comfort to make you small. When someone calls you in the dark and uses your name, it is a ransom of normalcy. You no longer feel free to assume the kindness of strangers. We don't know who called us. We didn't see a face clearly. We had months of later wondering that braided into our lives like a second routine: checking locks, walking closer to streetlights, flinching at late-night footsteps. There is a particular kind of sleepiness that only people who've sat up in fear know: the way your body enters rest while your mind remains cataloging dangers. For a while, I tried to rationalize everything into neat psychological boxes: projection, mishearing, coincidence. Those rationalizations helped me when the night was new. They didn't make the memory less invasive. Part of me wants to end the story there, on a note of survival, with us packing at dawn and the road stretching out like a clean sheet. Part of me knows that the shape of the story is not neat, and that leaving it there would be a lie.
There are more details. The moment a headlight paused 3 tenths away. The sound of a shovel again. The way the old car's trunk gave a heavy sigh that might have been a latch settling and might have been something else. There are also the little follow-ups, the phone calls I made later that week, the searches at odd hours, the sense of being watched even in a crowd. I hold on to the fact of our survival, not as proof of anything, but as a narrow, stubborn fortune. Surviving an eerie night does not mean you were brave. It can mean you were lucky, and that luck should not be mistaken for control. There is a humility in that, an understanding that the world has angles you can't always see, that people can be out there doing things you cannot imagine, and that names spoken in the dark can be weapons. I move now toward parts of the story I haven't fully told: the phone calls to police, the partial reports, the things I read that fit like puzzle pieces that may or may not belong. Those belong to the next stretch of the telling. For now, the night remains as it was, a sequence of small sounds folded into a single impossible moment, where someone outside the tent reached in and named me. That naming changed everything about how I understand the word safe. The night didn't end when we drove away. It ended as an incision that left a scar you can't see. On the drive home, the windows up against the wind, the tent smell lingering in my clothes, I realized that the danger of that night wasn't just the possibility of physical harm. It was the invasion of the small private things: your name, your pattern of movement, the knowledge that someone might be out there using the same sounds that mean comfort to make you small. When someone calls you in the dark and uses your name, it is a ransom of normalcy. You no longer feel free to assume the kindness of strangers. We don't know who called us. We didn't see a face clearly. We had months of later wondering that braided into our lives like a second routine: checking locks, walking closer to streetlights, flinching at late-night footsteps. There is a particular kind of sleepiness that only people who've sat up in fear know: the way your body enters rest while your mind remains cataloging dangers. For a while, I tried to rationalize everything into neat psychological boxes: projection, mishearing, coincidence. Those rationalizations helped me when the night was new. They didn't make the memory less invasive.
Part of me wants to end the story there, on a note of survival, with us packing at dawn and the road stretching out like a clean sheet. Part of me knows that the shape of the story is not neat, and that leaving it there would be a lie. There are more details. The moment a headlight paused 3/10 away, the sound of a shovel again, the way the old car's trunk gave a heavy sigh that might have been a latch settling, and might have been something else.
There are also the little follow-ups, the phone calls I made later that week, the searches at odd hours, the sense of being watched even in a crowd. I hold on to the fact of our survival not as proof of anything, but as a narrow, stubborn fortune. Surviving an eerie night does not mean you were brave. It can mean you were lucky, and that luck should not be mistaken for control. There is a humility in that, an understanding that the world has angles you can't always see, that people can be out there doing things you cannot imagine, and that names spoken in the dark can be weapons. After we had reached the safety of our own beds, showered, and pretending to return to normal, I did what anyone with a pulse and the internet does. I tried to turn the unknown into knowable things. I called the number for the local police station, and I left messages in the way tourists do, careful, deferential, as if there had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. There were answers of a kind, but they were thin. The woman who took the first report listened and typed and told me the obvious things in the soft institutional tone someone uses when they've heard most versions of a story before. Thank you for reporting. We'll note it. Did anyone see faces? Did anyone get plates? I couldn't say any of those things. I told her there had been lights, footsteps, a man screaming, and then a voice that called my name. She asked which beach. I gave the name of the small parking lot. She told me patrols would be increased if possible, but cautioned that these stretches of coastline attract late-night travelers and fishermen, and that resources are limited. Her voice conveyed policy rather than promise. Reconstructed. Exact phrasing on the police call is approximate. The summary is faithful to how these calls are generally handled. There were follow-up calls, mine, and perhaps others, though I would never know every thread. Weeks later, I got an email that read like a civilian translation of bureaucracy. There had been no arrests, no linked report, nothing to suggest a known suspect. That phrasing was a small legal way of saying we could not close the night into a single tidy answer. The police files I saw later were redacted enough to be frustrating, and whole enough to confirm that officers had visited the area in the nights after our leave. Whether they found anything they could act on was not clear. It felt like being handed a map with circles but no lines connecting them. I tried to be methodical, because being methodical is calmer than being afraid. I made lists, times, noises, possible witnesses, old articles, forum posts from urban explorers who'd parked where we had. I read a few accounts aloud to Anna and my parents as if speaking them into the air might change their gravity. Some were impossible to reconcile with our night, others fit like shards. One article I found spoke of a violent incident near a stretch of the same coast several years ago. The newspaper copy was dated and small and written in that lean, factual style that never tells you much about the weather, but tells you everything about the emptiness of evidence. In that piece, someone had been found near a beach parking lot, and there had been talk, settled rumors, about a man who spent nights in his car between runs, someone who might have had a history of angry outbursts. The piece did not say the person had been responsible for anything from our night. It only made the place look older and a little less innocent. Reconstructed, references to specific articles and their content are an amalgam of my searches and local recollections. They serve as context rather than proof. The more I dug, the word is accurate here, the more I realized how porous memory is. Local message boards contained messages from people who had noticed an old car by the lot before, creepers who liked sleeping in the dark for reasons I couldn't entirely parse. There were photos, low-light shots of a vehicle like the one we'd seen, rusted, window-streaked, polite in its loneliness. Some posts recounted a man shouting in the woods at night, or a brief scuffle near the dunes. Other posts were plainly trollish. The internet rewarded anxiety with crumbs and contradictions. You could take what you wanted from it, a pattern or a chaos. Months later, Anna and I drove back. This was not a triumphant return. It was a small, quiet test. Reconstructed, the decision to return and the exact conversations we had beforehand are my reconstructions. The places we visited align with what I remember wanting to see and the vague information police had provided to the public. We stopped at the gravel lot in daylight. Sunlight turned scary places into furniture. The trees were the same unremarkable green. The old car's paint flaked into the same pale ghosts. But small things are durable. The indentation in the gravel was still there, or at least the shape of the stones had not completely reassimilated. There was a line where the grass bent back into its own pattern. No one else was there.
We walked the path toward the beach and found cigarette butts, a tidied half-circle of stones that might once have been a fire ring. The scene didn't answer anything, but it fitted into my internal frame like a piece I'd been missing. On the drive home, in the light of the highway, we talked about what we'd do differently. We were both careful not to sound accusatory toward our parents. This had been a family decision, and it had worked out in the sense that no one had been physically harmed. Yet the decision to sleep in a gravel lot became a thing to circle in our minds, like a map of small regrets you can use to avoid similar errors later. I realized then that safety is often a stack of small choices. Occasionally, one bad coin flips the table. The psychological aftermath was less discreet than the physical.
The nights after that trip were an on and off thing. Sometimes I slept more or less like before. Sometimes every set of footsteps made me jump. I found myself timing things. I dreaded certain hours with a precision that made little sense to everyone around me. 2:17 became an internal bell. I would wake around then, every so often, as if the night expected a reply. That pattern irritated our close friends and made my mother anxious in a particular way. She would leave lights on the landing, or walk the house at night as if by making the rounds she could stitch back the softness that had been taken. There were small practical adjustments. I stopped camping in places where tents were thin and the parking was exposed. I refused rides from people I didn't trust. I learned to sleep with my phone charged and my keys on my bedside table. None of this is heroic. It is the opposite. It is the long, patient work of not giving fear more power than it needs to have. I did not want to be someone who let a single night define every outing thereafter, but some part of me was inherently simpler. The world had been quietly more dangerous than I'd allowed myself to assume, and the knowledge of that was invasive. Therapy helped. This is probably the place to say that without sounding like a platitude. I found a counselor who specialized in trauma and the small, chronic anxieties that trail people after an event like ours. We would sit and talk about the night as if it were a book we were reading together. I told the details, some of them blurred and repeating like a scratched record. She would ask me to notice where my voice changed and where my body did that little animal crouch when I told about the headlights. We worked on grounding techniques and on the idea that memory is malleable and yet still sacred. For me, naming that voice, calling it out loud and externalizing it, was a strange balm. It made the name less like a claim and more like data. Therapy also helped me realize something about fear. It is not only a physical spike, it is a narrative you tell yourself. If you tell yourself you are a target, you become more watchful, which can be protective, but it can also reduce the way you live. The work was to find a way to be safer without building fortresses that kept strangers and friends alike at bay. That is an uneven work, and I remain in it. I want to pull a few of those comparative vignettes closer to the center now, the little mirrors that showed me how the dark works. These are not full stories, and they are not mine to tell in detail, but they became part of the framework I used to understand our night. I remember reading, months later, about a woman, call her Alyssa in the forums, who noticed a car that waited outside her apartment for nights on end. She posted pictures of headlights pooling across the asphalt like oil-slick moons. She began to feel watched. One evening, she heard her name called from the street. It was casual, like someone asking for the time. She locked the door and called the police, who arrived to find a car with no plates and a man who claimed he had been lost. No legal follow-up is known. What struck me about Alyssa's account was the way the voice functioned as an opener, how easily ordinary language could be weaponized. I thought of her every time I noticed headlights at a distance. Alyssa is a composite name used to protect privacy. The gist of the story is drawn from several similar posts. There was the babysitter story too, which always made my skin crawl. A young sitter finds a car idling across the street for hours while the baby slumbers. The driver calls a name, a child's name, without knowing it belongs to anyone in that house. The sitter says she heard the call the way I did, clear and casual, right outside the window. She barricaded herself and called parents. In that story, the intruder moved away when the house became noisy. In other tellings, the man stayed. These stories share a tactic, the use of sound and familiar words to gauge response. They are, taken together, an instruction manual without the goodwill. I remember the sitter's fear when the driver's voice had the same texture as a neighbor calling for a dog. It was ordinary enough to be believable and terrifying for that reason. Then there are the urban explorer posts, people who go into abandoned schools or hospitals and find the silence heavy with other people. They report the sound of footsteps in the attic, a face at a boarded window, a thing lurking at the end of a hall. Those tales differ in setting, but not in mechanism. Predators often wait in the margins,
where people are alone and where their routines thin out. Predators use normality as camouflage. They rely on times and places where the world gives fewer witnesses. That idea lodged in my mind in a way that shifted how I moved through late hours. Again, these are reflections, not evidence. They taught me a vocabulary for what had happened and a set of cautions for travel and solitude. I should be careful with how I phrase the next part. There's always a temptation in the retelling of near-miss stories to let the narrative harden into a thriller that suggests villains with precise motives and plans. Real life is grayer. The person or persons outside our tent might have been hunting, lost, drunk, cruel, or merely curious. They might have been unconnected to the decades of rumors I found in my searches. The only thing I can assert is the experience itself, an intimate voice calling a name with all the consequences that followed. Time, too, does interesting work on memory. In the first months after the night, every detail felt raw and newly precise. Later, some lines blurred. Faces became silhouettes in my mind, sounds doubled back on themselves.
There were nights when the memory dwindled to a single image, the lamplight slicing into the tent like a blade, or a single sound, the metal-on-metal ring of a shovel. There were other nights when the whole scene flooded back like a film reel, with small things I hadn't remembered before, the way my father checked his watch, the way Anna's hand trembled, the specific scent of seaweed. Memory is both less and more trustworthy than you want. My family processed in different ways. My parents, who had been calm in the immediate aftermath, took a different tack later on. They doubled down on caution and tenderly on protective directives. No more roadside overnights. Never go anywhere alone at dusk. Carry a flashlight. They were relieved by our survival and frightened by the distance between a laugh and a scream. Anna, bless her, was practical. She wanted to write a detailed account for the police. She wanted to give them more than we had. A detailed timeline, sketches of the silhouettes, anything. She felt the event as a wrong that deserved documentation. I admired that impulse. We tried to be precise. We failed to be precise in enough areas to give them a prosecutable lead. There were late-night messages from friends. Someone would send a link to an article. Another would say, "Are you okay?" And those small check-ins mattered in the aggregate. They reminded me that I wasn't only a subject for my own rumination, but part of a network that cared. I didn't want my experience to become a cautionary tale only. I wanted it to be an honest examination of how fragile ordinary nights can be and of how normal people adapt without becoming lives defined by fear. Once, months after the event, I woke at 2:17 to the sound of rain on the window and a neighbor's radio playing quietly through the wall. My body did the old crouch reflex, the same animal response. And then, in the wet blue dark, something shifted. I could feel the difference between being visited by fear and living in a shadow. That distinction is not moral, it is practical. Fear tells you to run or to fight. Living in the shadow tells you to make long-term changes, routines that protect you without banning you from life. For me, that meant more planning and less improvisation on trips, carrying emergency numbers, and being more outspoken about where I planned to sleep when nights were uncertain. I don't want to give the impression that all response was stoic or even sensible. There were avoidance strategies that were less about safety than about hope. For a while, I avoided the beach entirely. Summer weekends that had once meant late-night walks by the water became something I observed from the distance of my car. I told myself it was temporary. It was easier to tell myself things like that back then, and sometimes they were true. I also met, by chance, someone who had a similar experience, and they gave me 2 small pieces of advice that have stayed.
The first was pragmatic. If you hear something that unsettles you, do not assume you will think clearly. Prepare simple plans in advance for what you will do if you feel threatened. The second was less practical and more painful. Grieving the normal you had is honest and acceptable. Both suggestions were quietly life-saving. The first kept me breathing. The second kept me from pretending I hadn't been changed. There are things I will never know. I will never know whether the person who called my name had been watching us all night, or whether it was an eerie coincidence of memory and the associative mind. I will never know whether we were deliberately targeted or merely encountered by someone who used a name they'd picked up somewhere else. The ambiguity is part of what makes the night persist. The mind is happiest with answers. When it doesn't get them, it produces conjecture. At one point, I considered writing a formal account for a magazine or a local paper, an essay that would parse the night from the angle of social patterns and seaside risks. I reached out to a writer friend and we exchanged notes. She told me the piece should be honest about my feelings while refraining from turning the night into a lurid object. I agreed. The problem was not the telling, but the risk that any public story could undo people's privacy or sensationalize trauma. There was also the layer of guilt that sometimes sits under survival. Would my public speaking of the event cause more fear in others, or would it help someone avoid the same situation? I don't have a firm answer to that. I only know that the story matters to me and to the people I was with. Not all nights after go dark in the same way. There have been ones where the memory has faded to a background hum, and nights when it barges in like someone opening a door. The audio rhythm of my life changed. Doors click differently, and voices call out in the street with a new potentiality. When someone calls my name in a busy room, I flinch less. When it happens in the night, the old bell rings in my chest. The world has become a place where I map my steps against memory and also against a cautious desire to live. A final thread: the ethics of telling such stories. There is a small moral knot in recounting near-miss horror. The temptation to embellish is real. More drama, clearer villain, more satisfying arc. I resist that. What I have given you is as close as I can get to the truth of my memory, with clarifications marked where I have filled in things later to make sense of the chronology. Reconstructed. Any detailed conversations I recall from that night have been partly reconstructed. Their emotional truth remains intact, even when exact phrasing does not. There are people who read stories like this and measure them for courage or foolishness. Some will say we should have driven on, that we were reckless. Others will say we were lucky. Both judgments have a grain of truth.
What I can say is this: ordinary choices sometimes sit on a knife edge. For us, a cheap place to sleep became an encounter that rewired us. I don't tell you this to frighten you into staying home. I tell you this because I think it's useful to know how quickly things can tilt and how a single sound, a cry, a name can reorient you. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is the soft paper wrapper it always is at 2 in the morning, I still hear that voice in the thinnest membrane of memory. The name lands on the chest like a pebble in a shoe, small, persistent, and impossible to ignore. The ache it leaves is not only fear, but a clarifying ache, a reminder that safety is partly luck and partly habit, and that the smallest carelessness can make a normal night into a story you repeat like a lesson. I keep telling the story because it matters that people understand how quickly normal life can become odd, and how the ordinary intimacy of a voice can be used against you. I tell it so that someone else might think twice about a roadside sleep, about a darkly parked car, about the meaning of a single call in the night. I tell it because telling it helps me hold the memory at a distance where it is instructive rather than paralyzing. On certain nights, especially quiet ones, when the clock nudges toward 2:17, I find myself testing the edges of the memory. I replay the voice, I measure the lights in my memory against the ones I now see in the city, and I ask, what would I have done differently? The answer is unsatisfying and simple. There are things I would change and things I know I couldn't have. The night taught me that the world is unpredictable, and that a voice calling your name can travel farther than you think. If you've ever had your name called in the dark, or an ordinary night fracture into something else, tell me about it. Tell the details you can stand to say aloud. Keep what must stay private. Leave your story in the comments so the rest of us can learn. And if you want to hear more true, unsettling stories like this one, subscribe. There are more.